was interesting. The first role I played in England was one of England's great queens, Queen Elizabeth, and it was directed by Sheikh Kapoor from another British colony, and it gave us a particular perspective on the culture, a culture that we felt we had a deep connection to, but perhaps had a sense of irreverence for. So I've always had quite a playful relationship with England, and then very very quickly I did a show in the West End. So my husband and I thought we'll rent a place, and then I fell pregnant, and then had 2 children with my husband in England, and so a lot of our early adventures together happened in England. So it holds it's inextricably linked with my personal life as well as my creative work.
So it's 1993, you're not long out of drama school, you're cast alongside Aussie acting icon Geoffrey Rush in David Mamet's Oleanna, a breakthrough role for you in many ways. Tell me how that production helps both your career and your confidence going forward.
It was seminal for me. I mean, obviously working opposite Geoffrey, who trained at Lecoq, and I'd seen everything he'd done on stage. I thought it doesn't get any better than this. And when I went to a theatre school in Australia and had zero expectations of ever working in the film industry. It's a cottage industry in Australia, which is what makes it fantastic, but it's small. And I just didn't think, I thought, at best I could have a stage career, and I was very happy with that. So to work with Geoffrey on that astonishing work, those of you who saw Oleanna, it just hit the ground at a time when the notion of political correctness was taking off. So, I mean, the fisticuffs and the explosive reaction that the audience had to the work it felt, without sounding too pretentious, it felt like what we're doing was kind of important or relevant. And I found that really addictive. And also there was I was desperately terrified. And I had a moment where there's a physical thing at the end of the performance, and I did a misstep and giggled on one of the runs, and the director took me aside and tore strips off me and said he was about to fire me, and I wept and wept and wept and wept, and Geoffrey said he'd never seen so much mucus come out of a human being. And he said, okay, now have you finished? We're going to get up and we're going to keep rehearsing. And it was one of those things, as a 22-year-old, where he said, it is not about you, it is about the work. I don't care what your politics are, this is about the audience's experience. And I pushed through it, and of course he was right. And so suddenly I wasn't putting my opinion, my perspective on the work. I just allowed the work to speak for itself. And as a result, it was absolutely thrilling to perform, but the audience had the experience. And so that notion that it is not for me, it is actually a generous act, it was sort of instilled in me right there, I think.
After more great theatre roles, you make your movie breakthrough in the aforementioned Elizabeth, your BAFTA-winning role there. Now, the role of Elizabeth I, such a daunting one. So how did you set about tackling it?
I ran 1,000 miles in the other direction. And, I mean, I do not know how I got the job. Jenny Shercourt did the hair and makeup, and it was the first proper screen test I'd ever done, where you get into hair and makeup and costume, and they sort of mock up some sets and they light you relatively well. And I had some of the worst wigs I've ever seen in my life on my head, like ferrets, red ferrets. And I thought, I'm bound not to get this job. And I was vaguely relieved, because I thought, you think of Flora Robson, and you think of Glenda Jackson and Judi Dench and all these people who have, although I don't think Judi had yet given her Elizabeth I. But there'd been enough of them. I thought, what have I got to what can I possibly add to that conversation? Who am I, a 26-year-old in Australia, think that I could possibly add to that? And it was Shaker's belief in me, and working title, being able to see through those terrible wigs and offer me the job. But what I did love was that Shaker, it wasn't that I had this. I mean, I'd done one film really, but he'd heard about me. I was in a production of The Seagull in Sydney, And he'd heard Vanessa Pereira, who a really fascinating casting agent who's now an agent here in Los Angeles. She had seen me on stage. And so I thought, well, they can obviously see that I can do something. So it didn't feel like stunt casting, although Eric Cantona was the French ambassador in the film, so there was a little bit of stunt casting going. So maybe I was stunt casting.
Now, that, as with many other roles, you immersed yourself in research. I know this is a technique for you, but when you absorb so much information, how do you decide which to cast aside and which to embrace to put into the performance?
Well, it's a little bit like, the idea of going to a dinner party and working out exactly what you're going to talk about. There's no conversation in that, there's no thrill in that, there's no surprise in that, and I wouldn't want to be at that dinner party, it'd be deathly dull. But you might think, I'm such and such is coming, or such and such is, been working on this project with, UNHCR, so maybe we can talk about Syrian refugees, or that might come up. It's a conversation, and so, you say it's a process. I don't know that I have a process necessarily, but it's a privilege and a joy to do the research. But what becomes relevant? It only the moment tells you what becomes relevant. And I think for me, what I learnt very quickly is, unlike a theatre production where you will hopefully have 6 weeks to rehearse, you get to go through that horrible 3rd week dip where it all falls apart and none of you can act, and then you find it again, and hopefully before opening night, sometimes afterwards, where you can then score it into yourself and as a group of people, where you work out what's relevant and not. And during the course of the run, you still keep reading the newspaper. Well, I'm showing my age, aren't I? And listening to music, and you still remain engaged in the world, so the meaning of the work still shifts. But you need to create that same environment when you're on set, whether you shoot for 6 weeks or 3 months, because the piecemeal nature, I think, of making films can actually deaden your sense of curiosity. You can become incurious very quickly. And I think the more you can keep your imagination alive and fluid, and alive to things that someone else might be reading or watching or listening to, the more relevant the thing can maintain, and the more electric, I think, and dangerous your relationship becomes to it.
After Elizabeth, you took on another regal role in Lord of the Rings. Now, why did you want to be part of that franchise, and did you always have the faith that it was going to be quite as impactful as it became?
I didn't really care, to be honest. I just wanted to work with Peter Jackson. Brain Dead, and all the zombie stuff that he and Fran had done. I love zombies. And so that really interested me. And he's got this intense sense of the ugly, which I thought would be really interesting to bring out in Tolkien's work. So it was the endeavour that interested me. I had no idea that it was going to be what it was. I guess somebody did. Maybe Peter and Fran did.
But you love zombies. Is that a role you long to take on in the future?
I think probably the zombie moment has passed. But yeah, I may have missed the moment there. I missed the vampire moment. I'm always behind the 8 ball.
Well, you certainly didn't miss your moment.
Zombie musical, maybe.
Oh, well, there you go.
Zombie comedy. Oh, no, they've already done that.
You certainly didn't miss your moment when they were casting The Aviator. Now, obviously, that was a very attractive project. You had the opportunity to be directed by Martin Scorsese, to star with Leonardo DiCaprio. Using that project as an example, how do you avoid the factor of intimidation, expectation, and pressure of that kind of situation?
I think because the challenge was so big, and I knew I could but disappoint legions of Hepburn fans, then you just have to throw caution to the wind, really, and know that you're going to screw up. But Scorsese, you're in a Scorsese film first and foremost, and he did the most generous, wonderful thing when we sat down to. We talked, obviously, remotely, but when we sat down to talk about it, because we filmed a large part of it in Montreal, and they'd already been filming for several weeks by the time I got there, and he just said, "Look, she was a redhead, but you look great blonde. You just be blonde. It doesn't matter. You don't. Oh, she has freckles. Don't worry about it. You can wear skirts. It doesn't." But he was basically saying to me, It doesn't. It doesn't matter. You can go as close as you possibly can, or not.
So you had a freedom.
Yeah, enormous freedom. But he took that pressure off me straight away. But what he did do, which was genius, is he set a list of films for me. He screened them, of course, because he would never have you watch them any other way. But he screened a whole lot of films for me. And what I realised was he was interested in a certain attack and a certain rhythm that, obviously Philadelphia Story, but bringing up Baby, and that there was a rhythm and an attack and a physicality to the Hepburn that, and also films that she wasn't in, but dialogue delivery. And if you've seen the film, the very first scene that I'm in, she just talks non-stop. And so I had a sense of the rhythmic approach to it, which you never know where a character is going to spring from. It can be from a rhythm.
When Todd Haynes called and said, "I want you to play Bob Dylan," what was your first thought?
I laughed. I mean, it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But I've seen all of Todd's films right back to those of you who haven't seen a bootleg copy of Superstar. Beg, borrow, or steal it. The Karen Carpenter story told through Barbie dolls. You will weep. I mean, we laugh, but it is. I laugh. I thought that's ridiculous. It was his student film, but it's absolutely astonishing. And so I thought, well, he must have a reason. And we sat down, and he had this Bible, this visual Bible, and so he sort of had me at hello. Really, I mean, because of his body of work, and I'd long wanted to work with him, and then as we got closer to it, I was filming the second Elizabeth II film, so you could actually put anyway, I won't go there, but we're filming it, and
in better wigs,
yeah, and I'd lost a lot of weight to play Bob Dylan, obviously, because he was a very skinny man, and so I was getting thinner and thinner and thinner on the set every lunchtime, glued to this incredible outtakes that his manager had given us of the '68 Electric Tour. And it was the only time I've seen my husband jealous, but it was a kind of a very strange experience to be playing Elizabeth I, and then preparing for Bob Dylan. But it was, and so I thought I can't do it. And we finished shooting in England on a Saturday, and I arrived in Montreal on the Sunday and started shooting on the Monday. And so it wasn't, I thought this is bound to be dreadful. But I got onto set, Todd cranked up the music, and I thought the only thing I can do is go for it. And if it's shit, he will tell me.
And it wasn't. And another offer you couldn't refuse came when Steven Spielberg called and asked you to play a villain in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a role that Steven Spielberg describes as his favourite ever villain. And so
he says that to all his villains.
Well, maybe he does. But how did it feel? How fun was it to be part of that Indiana Jones world?
It was incredible. And it was a bit like the Blues Brothers getting the band back together. It was just watching these people who had a long history together. I'm sure, stupid question, have you seen Star Wars? But to see Harrison Ford up there, just that sort of that accretion of cultural history, film history, just sits deeply within him. So it was a masterclass watching him on how to get it right tonally. Because he always gets it tonally right, as does Spielberg in those instances. And it was an absolute ball. I've got a photo, actually, of, this is how long ago it was, of Spielberg. He and one other person on the planet had been the first two people to get the first iPhone. And there's a photo of he and my two eldest sons sitting there looking at the first iPhone on the Indiana Jones set. So that's kind of one for the ages.
So many great film roles to discuss. I want to move on to The Curious Case of Benjamin Button. What is your most fond memory of that experience?
That was tough, actually. It was really tough. We were the first crew to go into New Orleans after Katrina. And so it was quite a lawless environment, and it was quite a scary place. There were 6 shootings, I think, in the first few days that we were there, and it was obviously my children were with me, and it was quite unsettling. And Fincher does, he of the 197 takes, and there was a lot of prosthetics. So often you'd start at 4 a.m, and you think, okay, well, a regular human being would have you finishing at 6 or 7 at night, but you'd find yourself there some nights at 11, still working. You felt like, the Witch of the West, melting, but you kept shooting. But it was astonishing because he is meticulous, but also so engaged as a director, and he knew he was at the beginning of that digital process, and it was one of the strongest memories I have is getting used to. I'm going to really date myself now, but getting used to the different rhythm that one has when one works with film, literal film in the camera, where you'll do 1, maybe 2 takes, and you'll stop, you'll decompress, you'll reload, you'll probably chat to the focus puller, you have a chat to the director, and then you will wind up again and do another take. Whereas this, we would just go and go and go and go and go, and so it felt. I felt like quite cultish actually at the beginning of the process, because it was an entirely new way of working, and so it's perfect for him because he often I think that most takes I did was probably about 36, but you will go through a dip where you'll all lose your way but come back, but you find a different type of rhythm, and also watching him really invent the way that you light on digital. Because often what happens is, I watched a Papatakis film called Les Abysses, based on The Maids, because I was about to do The Maids with the Sydney Theatre Company with Isabelle Huppert, and I was in Berlin, and I thought, great, I finally got a copy, I'll put it on, and I was so shocked because it looked like someone's terrible home video, shot on video, and this exquisite, beautifully, masterly lit film was it just, I wasn't being able to see it in the right way. But Fincher knows how most people are going to consume the work, and so he's lighting and shooting for the correct medium. So it was a very important and big privilege for me to have that sort of ability to be right there learning how to work on digital.
So many of the directors that you've mentioned tonight have different ways of working. It's my understanding that you like to talk through your characters with your directors. So on Blue Jasmine, how did you cope with someone as notoriously monosyllabic as Woody Allen?
No, I'll talk through the character if other people want to talk about it, but I have no idea who the character is. It's not, you can research till you're blue in the face, as I like to do, as much as my children will allow me. But it's not really until you get to the doing. Sometimes it will come off the script. Most of the times, it does. Maybe it comes from the theatre. But a lot of the clues and the points of interest do come from the script. But I think the work and the people that you're around reveal what you need to do and how you need to do it. And with Woody Allen, the direction was all there. On the first day, he was clearly displeased, and but then I later realised he didn't like the location, and he didn't like the scene, and he cut it. So, you learn not to take all that stuff personally. And I'm not one of those actors who likes. In fact, I distrust it. If someone says, that was great. I think, what's wrong? I'd rather know what's wrong so I can fix it. Yeah.
There was a lot wrong with Jasmine, which made her such a fascinating character to play, such a deluded individual in so many ways. What was the key to finding that character for you?
Oh, gosh, sweaty armpits. I think, I'm not being facetious, it was all about the difference with what was going on internally with the externals that she thought she was presenting. And so it's some of the most creative time, invisible creative time one has is with the costume designer on film, I have found. And working with Susie Benzinger, where everything was big, borrowed and stolen. I think the entire costume budget was about $3.50, and so we made a lot of calls to try and get stuff in, and we carefully plotted through what she was going to wear. So basically, a bit like Blanche Dubois, what was in her suitcase and how was she going to make that work for her? And so it was all about what she chose to put on, how she was trying to hold herself together, but also for me, what the cocktail of substances that she was on and how that would be, how a panic attack manifests itself. And at what point does someone realise they're having a panic attack? And so it's all those physical and sort of internal psychological symptoms versus the kind of the rehashed Vuitton that she was wearing.
Costumes were also a big part of Cinderella. So tell me about working with a very well-known costume designer on that one, and how costumes help you build the character, if at all they do.
Yeah, they do. I think the time you have with the costume designer, and that was Sandy Powell, who I've also worked with several times, and most recently on Carol. It's because a director won't be there at the fittings necessarily, but might want to see the pictures, and so you get to try things on and see how they feel and how that might affect the way you move, and therefore how you might think, and you get to have what could be quite sort of external, shallow conversations, but you end up talking about the psychology of the character. And then that extends into, for me, the camera tests. No one is looking at you. They're looking at you like an object. So you can try a lot of little bits and pieces out in the camera test and say, oh, that doesn't work, just to see what the scope might be under lights. It's a little bit like having your technical rehearsal, which is the most creative time when you're on stage with a production, because you're just trying to get the arc of the thing. The director and the lighting designer and the set designer are still tweaking, so they're not really concentrating on performance. And often that means, a bit like kids at a slumber party when the parents have told them to be quiet, the actors really start to play. And when you start to play, that's when you make discoveries. So if you can find any moments to play in what is often a very, serious, time-constrained, expensive business of making films, like a camera test, like a costume fitting, then you find those moments. But Sandy made such bold offers on Cinderella with colour that it was really, really exciting to try and live up to those offers that she'd made me as an actor.
It was really exciting to see you in your latest triumph, Carol. Now, this is a project that had been around for a number of years. It had gone through a number of directors, a number of different co-stars. You were always attached. Why did you always believe in this and want to hold on to this project so much?
I'd love to say it was the role, but really the role for me is the last point of entry. I'm not someone who sort of prepares all my things at home and then comes in and says, this is what I'm offering up. I just had I love the internal machinations of the characters who inhabit Patricia Highsmith's stories. And coincidentally, at the same year that we did Carol, Andrew, my husband, and I were producing a play called Switzerland, which is about Highsmith's fictitious meeting with her Ripley. And I discovered her writing, working with Minghella on The Talented Mr. Ripley all those years ago, and have just loved her ever since. And what I did really love about the screenplay, it's always dangerous to fall in love with the screenplay, because if a director just comes on and films the screenplay, then it won't become a film. But I did love that she'd balanced the perspectives in the film, so it felt like it had become its own entity, which often interesting books, novels never do. When there's always something missing. It's often those books or novels which have a flaw in them. The airport novels that make great films, because you feel like as a writer, as a director, you can get your hand inside them and make them your own. And I felt that Phyllis Nage had done that with the screenplay. But and so I was attached, and I thought it was all happening, it was all off, it was all on, and our production company, Dirty Films, got involved in trying to sort of stay with it. And then Sandy Powell had shown it to Todd, and just completely out of the blue one day when I thought it was all over, Todd Todd called and said, "Are you still interested?" And I said, "Well, if you're going to do it, let's go." And then he very quickly wanted to approach Rooney, which was perfect, just perfect. And then it became a film.
Rooney said that she was terrified working with you. Now you're this acting
Rightly
icon.
so.
Well, of course. So how do you make these co-stars even more terrified or less terrified, when it comes to doing the work?
I don't know. I mean, Rooney's terrifying in her own way. She's so self-possessed and contained. But she's able to access sort of such volcanic and surprising emotion on screen, and her choices, as an actress, have been so singular and interesting. I think that if she was, it didn't show.
This is a film, and the issues behind it we watch through 21st century eyes, but the 50s time period was key, wasn't it? And how did that really sort of factor into the performance, from everything from the physicality to the attitudes to the suppression of emotion?
Well, I think you would have lost all of the Highsmith spirit if you'd set it in a contemporary world, because there's always a criminal outsider element in her work, and this time it's the love affair that's the criminal aspect. So it was really important. It was in a time where that was illegal, illicit and illegal, or was for men. For women it was just a sign of borderline hysteria, and they needed to be institutionalised. They didn't even sort of merit the privilege of being thrown into jail. But it's the constraint, and I think it speaks of a time which we've all but lost, really, that sense of privacy and intimacy. I was just listening to a podcast today which was talking about how privacy is dead, and it's something of a bygone age, with sort of no analysis of why that might be, and is that perhaps a good thing for our culture moving forward, our psyches moving forward. But it was very, very important that I think for the poignancy of, for any hope that the audience would feel that the film was poignant, that the women are very isolated, and so their sense of their sexuality is it's not part of a subculture. It's not accepted. It's not discussed. Not only, even if you were straight in the 1950s, you didn't dissect and analyse your every internal machination. You didn't. You just didn't do it, and I think that gives a very particular mood and atmosphere, and as you suggested, did greatly influence the playing of it. That you have to sit on so much, which was a thrill to play.
Is there? You've had so many great teachers in your career. Is there a particular piece of advice that has sustained with you all these years that you've received?
Many. But I'll always remember a teacher when I was in first year at drama school. He said, "If you're going to fail gloriously," and that's always stuck with me.
She succeeded gloriously tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, Cate Blanchett.
Thank you.